Hello and welcome to show 25 of the MisesUK.org podcast with me, Andy Duncan, here in the splendid Henley-on-Thames. Tonight I'm speaking with one of our Mises UK faculty members, Dr. Matteo Salonia, who lectures at King's College in London on the early modern historical period from the 15th century to the French Revolution. He's also author of the recent book Genoa's Freedom. We'll be talking about the influence of Niccolo Machiavelli, the infamous 16th century author of The Prince, on the modern state and modern politics. We're going to try to examine how far the influence has stretched into the modern state and also into modern society. Welcome to the show, Dr. Matteo Salonia.
Hello, Andy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And it's great to speak with you again since our Mises UK conference.
Yes, indeed.
First of all, before we get going, I thought our listeners might want to learn a little bit more about you. So what brought you to Mises and to liberty?
Well, I am a historian, but I have some specific interests, and one of them is economic history. And I cannot say that there are many economic historians who know about the tradition of the Austrian School of Economics, but I have started to read Mises during my PhD at the University of Liverpool. And although I don't really use Mises specifically in my research, or I've not done that yet, I have immediately been impressed by Mises' reasoning and in general by some of the answers that the Austrian school gives to pressing issues, both in recent history and in general with regard to the study of human action and in the economic sphere specifically. So I will say, there isn't really a label that in which I feel myself comfortable. So I don't know if I'm really purely a libertarian, but surely I am an Austrian when it comes to economic theory. And I find it very useful in answering certain questions about the economic history of Europe and comparative economic history and global history.
And have you read then the Rothbard books on the history of intellectual thought?
Yes, I have. Yes, and indeed he has a few paragraphs on Machiavelli, if I'm not mistaken, and his reading of Machiavelli is pretty similar to mine.
Okay, so on to business then with Signor Machiavelli and the Prince. Now, this book's often been described as the first modern book on political philosophy. It first appeared in, I think, about 1513 in Florence, the Italian state of Florence. Did you think that this book did help create the modern state, or was it just a reflection of the beginnings of the modern state that was coming about anyway?
Well, probably both. Yes, The Prince was written around 1513, and then it was published in the 1530s for the first time. I think that it's useful for the listeners to briefly sum up what is the situation right now in the scholarship on Machiavelli. The scholarship on Machiavelli is really divided at the moment. I mean, it has always been really. And the question is always the old same questions. That is, was Machiavelli being serious when he wrote The Prince? Or is The Prince a sort of smokescreen, a sort of ironic message that we need to read between the lines? I think that right now the debate has been revived recently, and so the two fields among historians are again some historians thinking that Machiavelli was indeed proposing a groundbreaking interpretation of what a polity should be and what those who hold political power are entitled to do, and indeed what is necessary for them to do in certain circumstances, regardless of issues that have to do with traditional morality, religion, or simply what is decent in the relationship between human beings. And then on the other hand, there are other historians who think that Machiavelli was really a bleeding heart Republican, that he was not really meaning what he actually wrote in The Prince. This second group of historians usually, not always, but usually tends to emphasize a supposed difference that exists between the Prince on the one hand and other writings of Machiavelli, such as the Discourses on the other. Now, I completely disagree with this simply because I don't think that there is any dissonance. I don't think that there is any contradiction in what Machiavelli writes in The Prince and what Machiavelli writes in the Discourses or in other of his lesser-known writings.
Now, when I read The Prince myself, I found it extremely clear, and I later tried to read the Discourses, and I found it quite murky, so I'll take your word for that then. But he was imprisoned a few times, wasn't he, by the rulers of Florence? So maybe it could be some kind of weird, sarcastic sweep back at them. But let's take him at his word then. Let's take it that the Prince is what he was thinking. If he did, he seemed to love the state an awful lot. Now, did he love the state just for his own personal benefit, pleasing the rulers of Florence so that they would appoint him to be a senior person within their state? Or did he genuinely believe in a completely amoral state? And if so, why did he think this amoral state was such a good thing?
Well, I think that the answer to your question is yes in both cases. He definitely wanted to be hired again in the service of the state, which he had served when that state was had been a republic between about 1498 and 1512. Now, under the princely rule, he was imprisoned. Briefly imprisoned, tortured, and then he tried to find a new job in the service of the new prince. But again, I don't think that the issue for Machiavelli is really whether we should have a monarchy, princely rule, or a republic. I think that what Machiavelli is really interested in is the kind of state that we should have. And he has some really consistent notions about politics, the realm of politics, and what we could call a realistic view of politics in a sense, but is also a profoundly amoral view of the realm of politics. Machiavelli thinks that when it comes to politics, we should not discuss how men should behave or what men could be, but rather we should discuss how men actually behave and how they actually turn out to be. Now, so far so good. The problem is that by doing this, Machiavelli then creates a dichotomy between the moral standard that we apply to individuals when they interact with each other and a second moral standard or amoral standard that is the one that we apply to the state. And I think that you don't need to be a libertarian to notice that nowadays this is the situation in which we live. The state, not just the state in this country, but in general, in any country, the state is an entity, the government is an entity that can do things that will be unthinkable for an individual to do. And I'm not talking about the fact that it can do them because it has the means to do that, but I'm talking about the possibility of doing that without even debating the issue of whether they are moral or not. There are all a series of issues that we are not even debating anymore. We have just conceded to the state that the state can do this.
Yes, it does seem odd to me as well. If I go to a state court and they can prove that I've been lying in their state court, then I go to jail for however many years. But the Prime Minister can lie as much as he or she wants, and that's perfectly acceptable.
Well, that's a good example. Yes,
it's a bit like microeconomics, which everyone agrees with. Somehow, when you get to Keynesian economics, it just flips into something totally different once we get into aggregated things.
If I may add something else that may be useful, some historians on both camps agree that Machiavelli has a view of politics that is completely separated from religion, and they agree that he wants to reject the idea that religion, in particular the church, should have anything to do with the realm of politics. And some historians think that this is due to the fact that at the time in which he was writing, the church was actually a political player in Italy, right? So the church was in that contingent situation, a political player that could legitimately be excluded from the ideal situation that Machiavelli tries to depict both in The Prince and in the discourses. Now, what is missed in this analysis is the fact that Machiavelli's rejection of religion is not limited to the contingent situation, to the contingent historical circumstances in which he finds himself. Machiavelli rejects the figure of Christ as a model for human life. Machiavelli doesn't have a problem with the church in the specific circumstances in which he lives. Machiavelli has a problem with the very heart of the Christian message, because the heart of the Christian message is problematic if you are trying to build the modern state, or if you are trying to justify certain actions by rulers. Again, I repeat this: be these rulers princes or republics or officers acting as representatives of republics. This really doesn't matter to Machiavelli. So there is a great book by William Parsons that is called Machiavelli's Gospel, if I'm not mistaken, that details precisely this: the fact that The Prince, in a sense, is an attack against the teachings of Christ, because the teachings of Christ, according to Machiavelli, are an obstacle to the militarization of the state, because obviously Christ preaches peace, preaches forgiveness, but there's much more than that. It is really the fact that Christ is a bad example of politician, according to Machiavelli. So the examples that Machiavelli picks, for example, in chapter 6 of his book, The Prince, are examples of prophets who have been able to create new political orders. And there are prophets like Moses, Cyrus, and Romulus. Now, the obvious absence is the absence of Jesus Christ. And what Machiavelli is doing here is that he's basically indirectly criticizing Christ, because whereas these prophets whom he holds as positive models were armed prophets. They were ready to use violence. On the other hand, Christ was an unarmed prophet. He didn't have weapons. He didn't have an army. And actually, he forbade his followers from engaging in violence in order to defend him at the decisive moment. So you see, Machiavelli has a profound problem with Christianity that goes well beyond the contingent circumstances in which he finds himself and the specific situation of the church in early 16th century Italy.
Well, this seems odd to me because the Roman Empire, which was co-founded by Romulus, had failed, who was supposedly a great person, and yet Jesus Christ, who died killed by the Romans, his empire had lasted 15, 16 centuries from the time of his birth.
Well, Machiavelli has an answer for this. The answer of Machiavelli is that, from his perspective, he almost wants to say, unfortunately, unfortunately, the message of Christ became suddenly embodied in the Roman Empire.
I see.
In other words, the Roman Empire gave the weapons and the strength and the coercion that was necessary for the Christian message to be spread and to be successful. And then this has had, in turn, negative consequences on the territories of the Roman Empire, and in particular on Italy, because Machiavelli believes that Italians at his time are really unable to understand the art of politics and the art of war. Interestingly, one of his other writings is called indeed The Art of War, because Christianity has taught to Italians for many generations that they should not care, they should not particularly care about the things of this world. And among the things of this world, obviously, there's also politics. Secondly, Christianity has taught that violence is not something that is virtuous in and of itself. I mean, of course, somebody may engage in self-defense. That's good enough, but that's not good enough for Machiavelli. Machiavelli was also trying to argue implicitly against the natural law tradition that goes back to classical times, and so this is something that William Parsons doesn't really look into, because he's writing mostly about Machiavelli's attack against Christianity, but it's something that we need to consider as well.
Yeah. So how did he get away with this then? I know the Borgias and other political families had taken over the the papacy in Rome. But the Catholic Church is, was supposed to be based on Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, and amongst others, with natural law and with truth and so on. So how did Machiavelli get away with this in probably a very religious 16th century Italy?
Well, in part, we have to remember that some of these writings, most of these writings, were not published until after his death, and soon afterwards they were condemned both by the church and by many other writers across early modern Europe. And the other part of the answer is that Machiavelli, especially in The Prince, well, before you mentioned the fact that The Prince is really readable, right? But at the same time, it is also quite convoluted in the way in which it hints at some of these issues that I have just mentioned. So, for instance, Machiavelli would not say plainly, I don't think that the natural law tradition that gives us a moral standard should really be applied to the realm of politics. He doesn't really say this. But just to give you a brief example, in his classification of principalities in The Prince, he doesn't really care about whether a principality is organized in a way that is just or unjust, which was the classical way in which somebody will wade in and say what he believed about the right classification of principalities. Or he doesn't use the Aristotle's notion of the common good to evaluate whether this or that kind of principality was more conducive towards the common good or not. He simply orders the principalities based on how they have been acquired by the prince. So you see, his strategy is at the same time pretty clear, but he's not saying plainly, I want to reject the natural law tradition. This is pretty clear to a reader, but he sort of gets away with it in this way.
Yeah, he's not blunt. He's coming round sort of tangentially. Now, these writings were published, as you said, in the 1530s and so on after his death, and they spread around Europe like wildfire. How far, moving into the future then, how far do you think Machiavelli's principles have entered the role of modern politicians?
Well, as we said before, I think that the great Machiavellian idea that we are still struggling with is not so much in any graphic description of, for example, the idea that you should kill all of your enemies, or that if you conquer a new polity, you should at times get rid with spectacular shows of violence of those who have helped you to conquer that polity. It's not so much that, because we will all disagree with that, but it is instead this dichotomy that I mentioned at the beginning between the moral standard that we apply to individual human beings when they enter in relationships with each other, that may be economic or relationship of friendship and so on, and the standard that we apply to the political realm or the lack thereof. I mean, we don't really apply much of a standard, right? So this is, I will argue, the great success of Machiavelli, because he's the first one who really explains in a systematic way that the realm of politics should not have anything to do with considerations that are moral considerations or religious considerations.
Now, one of the principles of Machiavelli, though, is a prince or the ruler of a state should always appear good and honest to keep the people on side, but he should also tell lies whenever necessary to retain power, as long as he appears honest. Now, you say that these kind of principles have been successful in modern politics, but have we come to the end of Machiavelli? Because people now, I mean, I personally don't believe anything any politician ever says on principle. Occasionally they tell us the truth, but it's usually by accident and they beat themselves up for it afterwards. Is Machiavelli's problem now that we're coming to the end of the Machiavellian age? We don't believe any politicians anymore when they say anything. Should maybe he have kept his principles secret? Completely secret, and only fed them in a secret society to certain people in the future?
Well, this is a difficult question. I don't know the answer. I think that even though we all say that in general we don't trust politicians or any word that they utter, on the other hand, the issue of the state is rarely discussed. Okay, we may discuss for months or years the results of an election or this or that scandal surrounding this or that politician, but we don't really ever hear sophisticated debates about the nature of the state, the means employed on a daily basis by the state, regardless of which politician is in power, right? So that is, in a sense, where I will say that that Machiavelli is still alive and well. And again, I don't want to give the impression that, because I'm a historian, so I don't want to give the impression that I think that Machiavelli could foresee all of the things that have happened, or that he's responsible in any way for this. I'm simply saying that, Machiavelli's ideas were modern, that they were not conventional. And in this, I am disagreeing with some of my colleagues. They were not conventional ideas, and in this way, they were really modern.
Now, if he hadn't written them down, do you think somebody else would have written them down?
I mean, some historians like to assign so much importance to the historical context that they will probably tell you yes. But as a Misean, I will tell you no, because ideas are what moves history, and not the other way around. If we really have to come up with a recipe or with a general statement, right? I mean, there are exceptions one way or another, and the other. But in general, I wouldn't say that necessarily we will see somebody else writing the same things that Machiavelli was writing. Definitely, there are some historians who have underlined the fact that just before Machiavelli, or in the centuries before Machiavelli, other writers were saying that there are exceptions. There are some cases in which you are allowed to lie, or you are allowed not to be honest, for the sake of the state. Fine, fair enough. But Machiavelli was the first one to say that should not really be an exception. He was the first one to say that we shouldn't really care about applying a moral standard as, for the safety of the state and for the liberty of the state. We should accept that men have a certain nature, and we should be realistic about that nature, and we should not worry about religious or moral teachings.
No, I do think I disagree with something you said earlier. So I think there has been a bit of a sea change in politics. Thinking in the UK about 25 years ago, we all did trust Tony Blair when he came to power, and he seemed to be angelic. He seemed to be a truthful person. He seemed to only want the best for everybody. But it turned out 10, 15 years later that he was actually the most evil and most Machiavellian politician in Britain's history, even worse than anyone I can think of. So I think there has been a little bit of a change there. He used socialism, of course. Now, I usually think socialism is the worst enemy of mankind, but with Machiavellianism, we've kind of got this fascism, this insistence on centralisation, the accretion of military power, the takeover of other territories, the destruction of private wealth, the regimentation of society for the benefit of the state, and so on. And maybe he was looking at the Roman Empire before it became Christian as a model. Do you see socialism as the enemy, or Machiavellianism as our enemy?
Well, I think that the enemy is statism, isn't it? So, statism can take many different forms and shapes, and this is in part what we discuss at Mises. With regard to Machiavelli specifically, yes, of course, one of the characteristics that he gives to his form of statism has to do with the militarization of not just of the state but of society, because according to Machiavelli, being trained for war and being ready for war and engaging in warfare has an educational value on the citizen of this new order, of this new state. So it's not just a question of protecting the liberty of the republic. For Machiavelli, yes, of course, that's important, and that's why you should have your own arms and your own standing army. But there is also another issue, that is, for Machiavelli, engaging in warfare has an educational value, because it trains men and the citizens of the Republic in the new kind of virtues that are obviously completely different from the classical virtues, right, and from the Christian virtues. This is a new kind of virtue that is more like self-reliance and strength and virility.
Yeah, we see that, of course, with you'll correct me if I'm wrong, being a history lecturer. We see that with Napoleon, and we also see that with the rise of Prussia, who I think were both taking these Machiavellian ideas about building the welfare state.
It's interesting that you will mention Napoleon Napoleon, because obviously if Machiavelli was one of the stepping stones towards modernity in terms of political philosophy, the French Revolution was one of the stepping stones towards modernity in political history. And one of the most consistent efforts of revolutionary governments in France after 1789 was conscription, was building up a national army, which caused some troubles in certain areas of France that rebelled not only against the so-called values of the French Revolution, but also especially against the very pressing issue of being forced to join an army and being sent to fight.
Of course, well, if Machiavelli's created the French Revolution, of course, in the famous saying, we don't know whether the French Revolution's been good for us or not yet. Just to finish off then, overall, what's your assessment of Machiavelli? Was he good for us in a peculiar kind of way? Was he bad for us in an obvious way? And if he was bad for us, is there any way we can reverse the effect of his ideas to build a more civilized society again?
Well, earlier on, when I was trying to summarize really briefly, the scholarship on Machiavelli, I left out the fact that there are, even in some libertarian quarters, some people who are fascinated by this idea that Machiavelli was actually a bleeding heart Republican and was really interested in human liberty. Now, I was thinking about this in recently, and okay, there is a way in which this may be a useful way of thinking about Machiavelli, because yes, he does indeed unmask the true nature of the state, of the modern state, right? And that's something that can be useful. It can be useful to read Machiavelli to understand how the modern state established its philosophical foundations on this idea that it shouldn't be really judged by any moral standard. But if these libertarians mean to say something else, that is, we should read Machiavelli because actually that is what he really meant, so in the sense that he wanted to unmask the modern state in order to denounce it, well, no, I don't think so, because he was describing the modern state and endorsing it. So it is useful to read Machiavelli, as it is useful to read everything. But in my opinion, Machiavelli, also if we look at his own career, I mean, he was involved in the establishment of the first standing army with conscriptions in the Tuscan countryside. So I mean, if actions speak louder than words, that is an endorsement, right, of the militarized and centralized state that was just about to emerge in early modern Europe.
Yes, I think even Adam Smith ended up as a state customs tax inspector, which wasn't really a very good end for him. It almost sounds a bit like a 1984 as well. So if he's writing a book to unmask the state then goes on to use his book to build a modern state. And we have the same with 1984 by George Orwell. He writes the book as a warning, and it ends up as being a guidebook. So overall, in one sentence then, what's your assessment of Machiavelli's effect on history?
The justification of the growth of the state, even by the use of immoral means. This will be my assessment.
Fair enough. That's a great answer. Now, before we go, are there any? I mean, you've got this book on Genoa. Are there any other books or projects or anything else that you're working on that we need to know about?
Yes, the book just came out last year, and I'm working on currently on some papers for conferences, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate with Mises that may interest your libertarian listeners. Then other than that, I'm working on some other academic projects. I just published an academic article on Renaissance studies on the Spanish Empire, and I am starting to think about my next project for my next book that should be about the early modern origins of human rights discourses.
Fantastic. Well, for everyone who's listening, that book is Genoa's Freedom, and that's by Dr. Matteo Salonia. Okay, Matteo, thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight on the show. Arrivederci e a presto.
Arrivederci, it was a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed tonight's show with Dr. Matteo Salonia. While I sip my post-show glass of Pinot Noir, if you'd like to help us out here at Mises UK and you enjoyed the programme, please post any links to it on your favourite social media sites. Also, if you have any spare cash on hand that you want to save the world with, you can visit our donate page at misesuk.org, where I'm sure our esteemed chairman, Keir Martland, will be more than willing to help you save the world with this totally unnecessary cash that you're holding. In the meantime, we'll be back very soon with some other fabulous guests from the world of Austrian economics. Until then, please enjoy your property and freedom responsibly.